She wasn't expecting anything anymore. Her husband had passed away 7 years prior, and her routine was quiet, marked by photographs on the shelf and solitary cups in the cupboard. Then she received a letter. The unmarked envelope appeared mysteriously in her mailbox, addressed in her late husband's old handwriting. Inside, a short message, but one filled with details only he could have known. As she read it, she felt something impossible to explain, the same comfort she used to feel when he held her. It seemed absurd, yet also strangely comforting. How could one explain a letter written by someone who was no longer here? She wasn't alone. In various parts of the country, other widowed women, all over 62, began reporting similar experiences. Each case involved a specific detail that defied common logic. And it was precisely this that caught the attention of scholars of time, like Stephen Hawking, whose views on consciousness and continuity extended beyond traditional physics. The letters contained no predictions or promises. They brought back memories, simple advice, observations about the widow's daily routines, as if the sender were still keeping tabs on their lives from somewhere. In one instance, the recipient found an exact quote in the letter from a note her husband used to leave on the refrigerator door. In another, the letter mentioned the song she had listened to that morning, alone in the kitchen. The women's first reaction was astonishment. The second, a silence filled with questions. With time, fear turned into curiosity, and then into acceptance. Many began reporting improved sleep, relief from emotional pain, and even a return to old habits. If you've experienced something similar, or wish to understand this type of phenomenon better, subscribe to the channel and like this video. Here, we approach everything with seriousness, respect, and depth. One of the most well-known accounts came from a lady in Michigan who had lost her husband in a car accident. She had never spoken publicly about it, except to her daughter. One day, she received a letter in his handwriting, talking about the blue coat she wore the day they met. The woman swore she hadn't mentioned that to anyone in the last 20 years. The letter also asked her to forgive herself for not answering his last phone call, something that had tormented her until then. To her, that message didn't seem like the product of imagination. It was something that lifted a burden no therapist had been able to touch. When she brought this account to a research group on post-bereavement experiences, the case was documented as a phenomenon of unsolicited spontaneous communication, a term researchers use to describe unmediated messages received after someone's passing. What intrigues scientists isn't just the content of these letters, but their origin. None of them were sent digitally or by trackable mail. All appeared physically, in places associated with the widow's routines: a sewing basket, a forgotten book on a shelf, an old planner. Stephen Hawking, though skeptical of many spiritual approaches, raised profound questions about the nature of time and consciousness. He believed that time might not be linear as we perceive it, and that at some level, information could transcend physical death. In interviews and articles, he suggested that consciousness might be a fundamental property of the universe, not merely a product of the brain. This opened up avenues for reflection that are gaining traction today in light of cases like these. Science still doesn't have definitive answers, but it's beginning to ask more precise questions. These episodes should not be confused with spiritualism, classical mediumship, or sessions conducted by third parties. In all the cases studied, there was no active attempt at contact by the widows. The messages arrived unexpectedly, directly, and personally, and more importantly, they caused observable transformations. One of the women, who had stopped leaving her house after her companion's death, began attending the book club they both enjoyed. Another returned to writing in the diary she had set aside for almost a decade. These changes were not imposed by therapy or family obligations. They arose from something very intimate, as if they had received permission to carry on. That's the word many used, permission. As if someone from somewhere was telling them it was all right to move forward. Even among skeptics, there's a growing recognition that something happens in deep grief that defies traditional explanation. Neuroscientists have identified brain patterns activated by vivid memories that mimic the presence of loved ones. However, None of these explanations clearly justify the physical appearance of written messages. Therefore, researchers from different fields have begun to collaborate. Scholars of physics, psychology, and philosophy are coming together to explore what they call the intersection between consciousness and objective reality. While Stephen Hawking's name is often cited as someone who kept his feet firmly on the ground, many acknowledge that he also opened doors to questions that challenge the boundaries of what is known. And perhaps it is precisely this space between mystery and science that allows for new discoveries. In a letter received by a widow in Colorado, there was a specific comment about the scent of lavender she only used on special occasions. The perfume was a gift from her husband and had been worn on their wedding anniversary even after his death. The woman reported that she hadn't mentioned it to anyone that year. The letter simply said, "You looked lovely in lavender, as always." There was no signature, but it was clear to her where it came from. The experts who analyzed the case were intrigued not only by the specificity of the information, but by the effect it had. The lady, previously withdrawn and solitary, began visiting the places she used to frequent with her husband, as if something inside her had been liberated. She said she didn't need to understand how the letter had arrived. The simple fact of having read it was enough to re-establish a connection she thought she had lost forever, and that, in itself, was an answer. There is also the case of a woman in California whose husband had died in his sleep without any goodbyes. For years she carried the anguish of not having said farewell. One day, while cleaning the top of the cupboard, she found an envelope hidden behind old boxes. Inside, a simple letter said, "You were there for all the moments that mattered. I knew." The handwriting was familiar, but she couldn't recall ever seeing it before. The date was illegible. She took the note to handwriting experts who couldn't attest to forgery, but also found no way to confirm authenticity. For the widow, it mattered little. Reading those words, she felt something she described as a profound peace, unlike any previous experience. The letter became a kind of turning point. From then on, she began talking more with other widows, helping them cope with their grief. It was as if her pain had gained a purpose. Stephen Hawking said that we should look at the universe and try to understand not just what it is, but why it is the way it is. For him, even the most complex phenomena could be explained by natural laws, but that didn't mean everything was already understood. Reflecting on time, he suggested that past, present, and future might coexist in ways our linear minds cannot grasp. When we associate this with experiences like those of these widows, the possibility arises that at some level, the emotional information between two people can survive physical separation. This isn't communication in the traditional sense, but a transfer that disregards space and time. This idea doesn't prove anything on its own, but it invites a new way of looking at the bonds we create. And perhaps, by doing so, we are opening up space to understand experiences that once seemed merely symbolic or even improbable. Many human behavior researchers argue that grief is an intense form of presence. When someone departs, everything left behind takes on a new dimension: a forgotten coat, an old song, a letter. What was once routine becomes memory. And it is in this transformation that openings for extraordinary experiences can emerge. The letters received by these widows are not identical. Each has its own language, its own story, and its own way of touching the reader. But all have one thing in common: they awaken something that was dormant, be it a feeling of reconciliation, a forgotten memory, or the courage to move forward. In studying them, it is not necessary to prove their supernatural origin to recognize their value. It is enough to observe the impact they cause, and this impact is real, documented, and often lasting. Perhaps that is why these accounts deserve more than skepticism. They deserve to be heard. One of the most curious letters came with an old photograph. The recipient was a lady from Texas who had kept all her husband's photographs in a box in the basement. Upon opening the refrigerator, she found an envelope taped to it containing an image from an outing they took together in 1974. The remarkable detail was that she had lost that photo more than 20 years ago and had never found it again, despite numerous attempts. In the letter, there was only one sentence: This is the memory you needed most today. She told her family the story, and they were divided between astonishment and disbelief. The origin of the letter was never discovered, but the effect was immediate. For the first time since her loss, she hosted a dinner at home for her children and grandchildren, using the china she had saved since her husband's passing. That small message, accompanied by a forgotten image, was enough to break a cycle of loneliness. There is something about these experiences that goes beyond literal explanation. Even when one cannot affirm that the letter came from someone deceased, the emotional impact felt by the recipient is undeniable. Psychologists call this a symbolic catalyst, something that awakens deep emotional reactions without the need for objective explanation. However, the question remains, how do these messages appear with such specific and inaccessible details? This is what defies common logic. At the same time, it forces us to reevaluate what we consider possible within reality. When older individuals with decades of shared life say they recognize the essence of their deceased companion in a simple written phrase, perhaps it is wise to listen. Perhaps what we call impossible is simply what we have not yet fully understood. And listening to these stories with respect is the first step toward expanding our understanding of life. Upon examining the letters, specialists noticed a subtle recurring pattern. The choice of words mirrored the unique ways of speaking of the deceased. Old expressions, specific diminutives, and even nicknames not used for decades appeared in the texts. This further intrigued researchers, as many of these details weren't even recorded in documents or on social media. One researcher involved with the topic highlighted that the complexity of these messages surpassed what could be expected from simple coincidences. He didn't claim it was communication from beyond, but rather something that demanded a new perspective on the human mind, on memory, and on the bond between two people. By all indications, what remains is not just a memory, but the continuity of a connection that defies time and known physical rules. This is what makes these letters so difficult to disregard. Some widows reported that after receiving the messages, they began to have clearer dreams about their partners. These weren't nightmares or unrealistic fantasies, but simple encounters, as if they continued to live their routine together. One lady from Illinois recounted that for 2 months, she dreamed every week of her husband reading the newspaper while she made coffee, just like in the old days. She would wake up with a sense of calm she hadn't felt in years. This caught the attention of sleep and neuroscience researchers, who began investigating the positive effects of these experiences on the emotional and even physical health of the widows. Preliminary results indicate a reduction in anxiety symptoms, improved appetite, and increased socialization among those who had such experiences. This reinforces the idea that the explanation behind the letters matters less than the real impact they have on the lives of those who receive them. Other curious accounts emerged after similar cases were publicly featured on television. Upon watching the testimonials, some widows realized they had experienced similar things, but had either ignored or forgotten them. A woman from Ohio recalled a note she found inside a cake recipe written by her husband, years after his death. At the time, she thought it was just something he had left before he passed away. After hearing similar stories, she began to consider the possibility that it might have come about in another way. She decided to write about it in a local newspaper, and within a few days, she received dozens of letters from women thanking her for sharing that memory. The collective effect of these accounts began to draw the attention of sociologists, who study how personal experiences transform into silent movements of reconnection and meaning. In times of such fragmentation, these kinds of stories reclaim a rare sense of belonging. These experiences also spark an important reflection on aging. Often loneliness is treated as something inevitable in old age, especially after the loss of a partner. However, the letter accounts show another possibility, that the bond, even in physical absence, can continue to offer support, courage, and motivation. This doesn't mean living in the past, but finding strength in what was genuinely lived. When a 70-year-old woman says that a phrase from a letter made her resume gardening or walking in the park, she's showing us something beyond mere comfort. She's saying that human connection can remain active even when the other person has passed on. This redefines the idea of presence. It's not something limited to touch or voice, but also to the transforming memory and the message that arrives at just the right time, even if it seems impossible. Many mental health professionals have begun to rethink their approaches based on these cases. Previously, accounts like these might have been seen as illusions or symptoms of unresolved grief. Today, with more data and testimonials, the idea is growing that these experiences can be natural and even beneficial. Instead of denying or correcting, professionals have started to listen, embrace, and explore with the widows what these messages mean to them. Some clinics have even incorporated spaces for seniors to share letters, dreams, or signs they've received. The focus isn't on proving if they are real, but on understanding what they represent. In many cases, these exchanges have led to significant improvements in emotional health, and that in itself justifies the care. By validating the experience, one respects each person's pain and history without imposing ready-made explanations. Listening becomes healing. This is not about creating a new doctrine or replacing existing beliefs. What these letters represent is an opening to a new way of understanding human connection. Even without an exact explanation, there is something in these experiences that invites reflection and respect. Stephen Hawking, with his mind focused on the infinite, never claimed to have answers for everything, but he insisted on the importance of continuing to ask questions. Perhaps these letters, with their mysteries and precise details, are just another one of those questions we still cannot answer. But while we seek to understand, we can recognize the value they hold for those who received them. And in that recognition, perhaps we also find a more human way of dealing with loss, with love, and with the continuation of life, even in its most subtle form. There is wisdom in this writing silence, and perhaps it is telling us more than we think. Science always advances where there is courage to investigate what is not yet understood. Cases like those of these widows open space for interdisciplinary studies that combine physics, psychology, and even philosophy. The interest in these letters is not an attempt to prove the supernatural, but to explore how consciousness, time, and bonds affect human experience. When a person receives a message that brings peace, even without a logical explanation, the fact is that something changes, and that change is real. Attentive researchers realize that ignoring these experiences would be to miss an opportunity to learn more about the functioning of the mind and emotions. Just as Stephen Hawking challenged time by proposing it could be curved, perhaps it's also time to accept that communication between people may not be limited to traditional channels. Even if we are far from understanding everything, the path to understanding begins with a willingness to listen. Revisiting these stories, one realizes they all have something in common: the power of words at the right time. Even those who never believed in messages from beyond recognize the power of a phrase that arrives when it's most needed. The impact of these letters goes beyond curiosity. They touch deep areas of life where logic often doesn't reach. It's not necessary to see to believe, but to feel, to remember. To remember what was lived, what was shared, and what still remains, even after death. When an elderly woman finds the courage to write in her diary again after decades, when another starts wearing a dress she'd kept out of longing, it shows that the messages were not only read but embraced, and that is enough for them to have value. In times when everything is measured, compared, and explained, perhaps this kind of experience reminds us of the value of things that are simply lived. Stephen Hawking once wrote that the universe would not be much if it weren't the home of the people we love. This sentence, coming from a scientist known for his rigor, reveals a sensibility that few expect from science. It shows us that the search for answers does not exclude affection, and that understanding the cosmos can also mean understanding the human heart. The letters received by these widows may never find a definitive place in the libraries of science, but they occupy a legitimate space in the memory and healing of those who experience them. This in itself is significant. By listening to these stories, we are invited to broaden our internal boundaries to consider that life may have other forms of continuity. We don't need to accept everything without questioning, but neither should we reject what doesn't fit into our current schemes. The unknown is not always a sign of error. Sometimes it is just the beginning of a new stage of understanding. For many of these women, the simple act of talking about the letter they received is liberating. For a long time, they kept silent for fear of judgment or appearing fragile. But by sharing their stories, they discovered they were not alone. This exchange strengthens them. It creates real support networks, built not on theory, but on experience. Some have started writing together, forming small groups where they share not only letters, but memories, fears, and plans. This transforms grief into creation. Absence becomes presence in another form, and life continues with more lightness. What began as an individual doubt turns into a collective strength. A phrase written by someone who has passed on can become the necessary impetus to begin anew, and so, quietly, pain gives way to something new. Not necessarily complete happiness, but a possible peace, a serenity that grows with time. It is important to clarify that these experiences do not promise miracles or replace the grieving process. The suffering from the loss of a loved one is real, profound, and deserves respect. However, it is also true that life does not completely extinguish when a cycle ends. These messages, whatever their origin, represent a chance to look at the past with gratitude and at the present with more openness. For those who lived decades alongside someone and felt that bond broken, receiving a message that rekindles this connection can be a turning point. It doesn't eliminate the pain, but it offers meaning. And meaning is what many seek after a loss. There are no formulas for this, no ready answers. There are, however, accounts, sharing and listening, and that can be the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where absence is acknowledged, but is no longer the only voice to be heard. If you've made it this far, it's because you also value these stories that blend mystery, love, and the search for meaning. Perhaps you yourself know someone who has gone through something similar, or perhaps you hold a memory you've never known how to explain. This video was made to open that conversation, without impositions but with respect. If it touched something within you, consider sharing it with others who might benefit from this reflection. And if you wish to follow more content like this, subscribe to the channel. Here we always strive to bring topics that respect your intelligence, your history, and your sensitivity, because every life carries memories that deserve to be cherished. And sometimes a simple letter is enough to rekindle what seemed extinguished. The most important thing to remember is that you are not alone. There are others listening, feeling, and reconnecting as well.